Welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. May I ask everyone in the public gallery to turn off any electrical devices so as not to interfere with proceedings. Item 1 is a decision by the committee to take item 4 in private. Are we agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. We now turn to item 2 on the agenda, which relates to the European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation EU Exit Regulations 2019, which the committee has been asked to consider the notification from the Scottish Government. The regulations set out procedure for approving UK public entities' participation in EGTCs after EU exit. At its meeting on 25th June, the committee agreed to seek further information on the regulations, and this is contained in members' papers. Is the committee content for these issues to be dealt with by statutory instrument laid at Westminster?
Yes.
Thank you. As the committee is content, I will write to the Minister to notify him of the committee's decision. We now turn to item 3 on the agenda, and this is the subordinate legislation, namely the Debt Arrangement Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019, which are in draft before the committee. And we have a number of witnesses who are joining us now for this session. And if I could start off by introducing these as they get themselves settled. Starting from my right to left, first of all, we have Alan McIntosh, Senior Money Advisor, Inverclyde Council. Then Yvonne McDermott, who's the Chief Executive of Money Advice Scotland. Mike Holmyard, who's the Financial Health Policy Manager for Citizens Advice Scotland. Angela Kaczmierczyk, who is from the Financial Inclusion Team, or in fact the Financial Inclusion Team leader at Aberdeen City Council. And finally, Sharon Bell, who's the head of Step Change Debt Charity Scotland. So may I welcome all of you here to the committee today. And just for those who may not have been in committee before, the sound system will be operated by the sound desk, so no need to press any buttons or anything. If you want to come into the discussion at any point, please just indicate to me by motioning with your hand, and I will try and bring you in as time and the session permits. So perhaps I could start with a somewhat general question on these regulations. Some respondents have highlighted what they see as a current crisis in money advice funding. And I'm just wondering, do you agree there is such a crisis, or is that a slightly exaggerated word? And do you think these regulations help to deal with the situation currently arising in debt advice? I'll start with Yvonne McDermott.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think crisis, is there a crisis? Yes, there is. I've been involved in debt advice now for 30 years, and I have obviously lived through different economic cycles, but I have not seen it as bad as it is now. We're losing a lot of advisors, and we're not able to retain the advice and the quality of advice, which is really, really important. So for me, yes, there is a crisis. We need to have some kind of step change towards having a better funded system than we have at present. And I think the regulations may in some way go towards that, but there is a much wider debate to have, and it shouldn't be down to one particular thing. I think we need to have a debt advice levy for Scotland that looks at all solutions, all the statutory solutions. And for me and the organisation, that's really, really important.
May I just ask, I mean, that there are certain points raised about the regulations and the various submissions. Do you agree that the regulations are a step in the right direction, and that further improvement could, if the regulations were put into force thereafter, be introduced and discussed? Because some would say, well, you can discuss things forever, but you have to start somewhere. Do you have a view on that, whether or not these regulations are suitable to be introduced now and for the discussion to carry on?
Yes. With regard to the short-term financial crisis break, that is definitely a good thing because people's lives are not linear. They have cycles in their life where they can cope, and with a debt arrangement scheme or debt payment programme, that requires a longer period of time than the other statutory solutions, so it's quite hard for someone to retain that. So yes to that, and the automatic approval process should actually help the advisors as well and lift the administrative burdens from the advisors because they're suffering from that. They're really suffering from compassion fatigue at the moment. And we've been doing some research, and the well-being of advisors is definitely on the way down and not on the way up. So these regulations, yes, they maybe don't go far enough in some respects, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, and I think we need to protect debtors who are in vulnerable situations and who could really benefit, particularly from the short-term financial crisis payment breaks. I think that's crucial for people.
All right, I think Ellen McIntosh, you want to come in?
Yeah, Mr Chairman, thanks. I would concur with Yvonne. We're in a crisis, and I think in my submission I've described it as an existential crisis for some agencies. Last year we lost a couple of agencies in citizens' advice bureaus and law centres. I think this year, at the end of the financial year, we'll lose another couple of agencies. And I think at some point, and I think we'll also, some agencies may survive, but many will survive, but their capacity will be further reduced. If we look at the improvement services figures, they've been monitoring money advice funding for the last I think it's since 2014. And since 2014 to 2017, they're reporting money advice funding by local authorities, who are by far the biggest provider of funding for money advice. And that's not just local authority services, it's also citizens' advice bureaus. And they're reporting their funding from between 2014 down to 2017 has been reduced by 45%. The Money Advice and Pension Service, or its predecessor, the Money Advice Service, basically stating that Scotland is 50% under capacity for free money advice. So there is, basically objective evidence there to support what we're actually seeing on the ground as well. And even if I can use my own organisation, which is very typical, Inverclyde Council, we've got 4 money advisors that all do the debt arrangement scheme at the moment. 2 of those money advisors are funded by external sources, the big lottery. That funding will come to an end next year, and Inverclyde Council is in the same position that every other council has across Scotland in terms of funds are getting scarce, they're using reserves. So we're facing the prospect that our capacity will be reduced by another 50% possibly at the end of next year. Whether these regulations go in the right step, I believe they do. I was on the Dash Regulator Working Group throughout this whole process. I think there was general agreement with creditors and the money advice and insolvency industry that creditors have to pay more. The chairperson of the Money Advice and Pension Service, he's recently called for the Financial Conduct Authority debt advice levy to be increased by another 100%. He asked for it to be increased to £100 million. So there is general consensus that creditors have to pay more. And as much as these regulations are underpinned by that sort of principle, I think they go in the right direction. However, I think we've got to appreciate that these regulations, I think, could radically change the money advice landscape in Scotland, and I don't think necessarily for the better. And I think they could easily be fixed by some redrafting that would make them really help improve the service. But as they stand at the moment, I don't think they're fit for purpose.
Right, Mike Holmyard.
If I can just agree with my colleagues here about the funding crisis, and certainly from the Citizens Advice Bureau network point of view, as Alan's already alluded to, we've actually had to shut down some services because they weren't funded anymore. In whether these regulations will actually fix the problem, I don't really think so. They deal with one debt solution. But, for example, in our Citizens Advice Bureaus, it's quite common to do a number of other debt solutions, repayment plans, for example, standard repayment plans, which are not funded in this way. So we're setting up an artificial choice between a repayment plan where nobody gets funding, a debt arrangement scheme where somebody gets funded, a payment distributor gets funded, and potentially a money advisor gets funded, protected trust deeds where trustees benefit from fees. I think we're just mixing things up here rather than actually approaching the core issue, which is the actual funding of the free debt advice sector. And these regulations in particular are probably going to benefit a few commercial providers who have the resources to actually build up to meet the demand. And that's fine in that it's helping people, and we're all about helping people. But I don't think, on the face of it, these regulations are going to do a lot for the free advice sector. Well, certainly the cab network anyway.
So are you saying they're a step in the right direction, but not the whole
They're a step
direction?
in the right direction, but the fact is that actually the whole funding of the free advice sector through these regulations is actually not on the face of the regulations. There's a big black hole there in terms of how we are meant to understand how we get paid from this. The accountant in bankruptcy is talking of essentially a market of payment distributors where an advisor in one of the cabs would have the choice of a series of commercial payment distributors and the AIB to turn to make a choice about which payment distributor to use. You know, that there's a lot of extra work being created here, actually. The point of these regulations was to simplify the debt arrangement scheme. I think for the free advice sector who don't have payment distribution facilities, it's actually going to cause more problems.
Well, perhaps at that point we could move on to John Mason, who has questions, I think, that follow on from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Convener, because the whole question, that's right, of funding the advice sector, the free advice sector, there's been a number of people who have submitted evidence have talked about the AIB and the whole question of, are they going to distribute some of the money when they become a payment distributor, and how much of that, and is it regulated enough, and so on and so forth. So I'd be interested in your comments kind of in that area as to whether you feel what's proposed for the AIB is satisfactory, or is it transparent enough, and should there be any more detail about it? Mr McIntosh.
Mr Mason. In relation to that issue, as I say, I was on the regulatory working group with Mike, and I think Sharon was on it as well. We were actually in the middle of a consultation on returning fees to the free sector when these regulations were laid, and that came a bit as a surprise because we thought we were still having this conversation with the accounting bankruptcy, and then suddenly we've seen regulations being laid with no provisions in it for money to be going back to the free sector. And I've commented on the fee structure about how it only gives all the money to the payment distributor, but it doesn't seem to recognise the role that the money advisor plays in it. There's three real service providers in the debt arrangement scheme. One is the payment distributor, one is the actual accounting bankruptcy, and there's a payment distribution fee, there's accounting bankruptcy or debt arrangement scheme administrator fee, but there's no money advisor fee, which seems a bit, you know, it's quite surprised me, and it's totally different to the model that's been suggested by the UK government for the breathing space, which is the more common sense model of, as a fee for each sector. So that surprised me, and I think it shocked everyone.
I mean, can I just, to be kind of devil's advocate, I mean, some people would then say, well, the normal payment distributors might be out for themselves, but the accountants in bankruptcy take an overall view, and they will be more supportive of your sector.
Well, yeah, if I can come to that point, I mean, the thing was, yeah, I mean, at first there was no costing, we didn't know how much we were going to get, we didn't know how we were going to get it back, and we put a bit of pressure on them, obviously, and they've since then come out the costings, and they're actually suggesting that we should get 15% of the 20% back, which I think is actually a bit correct, because at the moment, you know, there's a number of payment distributors that do it for under 5%, so I've no complaints with the amount that they've now proposed. My concern is it's not in regulations, and it's only for 3 years, and it could be reviewed. You know, I noted from step changes, and I want to comment on this, but I noticed from step changes submission and that they actually suggest that the accounting bankruptcy can't do it for 5%. It'd be too much, or that would be too cheap, which I found quite surprising, because out of the 4 payment distributors at the moment, 3 of them currently do it for under 5%. So I found that quite surprising that step change are suggesting that the accounting bankruptcy can't do it. I would like to see it in regulations, and what actually the step change suggests in this is that in actual fact the IB should withdraw that paper and that proposal, that in actual fact that money advisors should pass cases to them, and you know, that possibly then we wouldn't be getting the 5% or the 15%. And I find that quite surprising, but I think this has to go into regulations. We need this safeguarded.
Right, okay, I think Ms Bell, you've been kind of mentioned in there. Do you want to come back in?
Okay, thank you. Just for clarity, that we are a free-to-client money advisor, but we are also a continuing money advisor that's a payment distributor. So we are, with regards to the panel, the only payment distributor organisation that's given evidence before the committee today. At the present moment, under the tender arrangements, we charge 8% for payment distribution, and that covers our payment distribution costs. None of that covers our money advice costs. I would agree with my colleagues on the panel that there is a crisis in the funding of money advice, not just in Scotland but UK-wide. And the charity has seen a significant change in that. My comment in the paper and the evidence to the committee was that I was not clear from the information from the accountant in bankruptcy that they could evidence that they could provide a payment distribution function for under 5% or for just 5% over at least the initial years as they built up numbers. One, they hadn't had clarification on the number of cases they were going to be getting. They didn't know how many staff they would be needing to actually undertake the process. They didn't have an understanding of how much they would actually get back. They were working on averages. And my concern was that if they were not able to cover their costs for the 5%, then the public purse would have to cover that cost, which does seem to be against the concept of these regulations.
And I mean, is your experience of the accountants in bankruptcy to date that they are good at controlling their costs or not good at controlling their costs? Because I think there was some evidence that other people thought maybe they weren't very good at controlling their costs.
I think the difficulty at the present moment is that they just don't have enough information in order to clarify those costs. And I think majority of us would agree that it's not clear yet what the actual costs are. Generally speaking, they work within the budgets that they are allocated from the government, and on the whole work within their costs. But they're also just introduced a new IT system, which they're hoping will have some savings to the process, but that's had some difficulties over the last few weeks since it's been introduced, and it's causing us significant increase in our costs, so not necessarily comfortable that they are certain of their costings.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one of the others do any of the others want to come in? Mr. Holmyard.
We have no issue with the AIB being a payment distributor. I think the issue comes back to, as Alan says, is the lack of detail about how that gets done. And from a Citizens Advice Bureau network point of view, you know, we don't particularly want to be entering into commercial arrangements with anybody else to do this payment distribution work for us. But you know, this is what the impact of the regulations will be. It will open up a market in payment distribution. So if we have the accountant in bankruptcy as our payment distributor, then that deals with issues of independence and impartiality that we want to preserve for the Citizens Advice Bureau network.
Okay, thank you. If the others don't want to come in, I'll move on to my second point, which is the suggestion that's been made again by some people that there's been too much of a growth in protected trust deeds, and one of the aims of all of this is to swing the balance back towards DAS. So, I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Is that a problem with the protected trust deeds? Will it swing the balance, or will it swing the balance too much, or do we just not know? Mr. McIntosh.
Looking at me, I was going to be rescued, my colleagues there, but I think there has been a growth in protected trust deeds, and what we've seen a commercialisation of the trust deed market. I think the credit unions, I'd be very surprised if they don't speak quite a bit about that, because it's something that's very close to their hearts. I think and you know, we spend a lot of times as money advisors, and I think it's in Money Advice Scotland's submission, where you know, money advisors tend to spend a lot of time fixing other people's cases nowadays rather than actually dealing with new cases, and some of those cases are trust deeds. So I think there has been a problem with it, but I think the danger is with these proposals or these regulations. I think Mike Daly, wrong person, Mike Homeyard and Money Advice Scotland also touch on this. And that there is a danger that we will incentivise people to mis-sell truck debt arrangement schemes. So, you know, we don't solve the problem with trustees by incentivising people, you know, by giving them 20% to go out and basically almost sell the debt arrangement scheme. Because bad advice is bad advice, and although the debt arrangement scheme is a very good solution, as is trustees, when it's applied to people in the wrong cases, then obviously it can cause consumer harm. So I don't think this is necessary, because I think what you're going to do here, and I think Mike's touched on it, is what you're going to do here is you're basically saying to people, go out and sell debt arrangement schemes now, and we'll give you 20%. And I think what we'll see is lead generators getting into this market in the same way they get into the trust deed market, in the same way they get into the PPI market, you know, and this will be sold now like a financial product, and with all the risks that brings and mis-selling, and I think so, well, will lead to consumer harm. So I don't know if this is this, we need to deal with the trustee problem, but this isn't the solution by creating another problem. And that's my personal view.
Okay. I see some nods. Ms McDermott?
I would concur with what Alan has said. I think we need to be very careful of any perverse incentives here, because it's a good scheme, the DAS scheme. It has been improved over time. Like some others round the table, I was there at the beginning with DAS, and we get some things changed about the interest getting frozen. Now we've got the payment breaks, variations, etc. So it is a good product, but it's making sure it's the right thing for the person, and it's not actually pushing them, as Alan says, down a route because it's actually going to generate income. So I think separating things out is really, really important to ensure that it isn't a perverse incentive and that people are actually given the solutions, because after all, that's what the Financial Conduct Authority requires, is that you actually give debt advice, debt counselling, and you look at what the recommendation is for that individual based on the information that they have given you, based on their income and expenditure, and obviously what their future holds as well. So I think we need to be really, really careful, you know, not to try and fix that problem over there, because the DAS product itself is a good one, but don't let's change it in a way that's actually going to have a perverse incentive.
I mean, I take your point that you don't, that's right, you don't want to kind of skew it too far in favour of the debt arrangement schemes, but if it has already been skewed too far for the protected trust deeds, does this not just kind of make it more of a level playing field?
Well, I think the way to deal with it is actually to change the protected trust deed itself. That would be the way to fix it, because I'm sure they would end up, if we can see what the consequences might be, there'll be those that are unintended ones that we haven't yet thought about. So I think it's really important that we deal with it in and of itself, but as part of a package as well of the statutory debt solutions.
Okay, thanks. Mr Homeyard?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, actually. Just the package of debt solutions needs to be looked at as a whole. You can't go making adjustments to one and then the other, hoping that it's going to even out. You need to look at everything in the round.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Angela Constance.
We've strayed into the territory that I was interested in terms of how we guard against perverse incentives around DAS being used when perhaps it maybe wouldn't be in the client's best interest. So, I mean, if any other members of the panel have anything to add to the contribution that Mr Homeyard and Ms McDermott and others have made, I'd be willing to hear that. But I'm just wondering, given the very last remark that Mr Homeyard made, is whether the panel felt that actually what's required over and above regulations specific to DAS, whether what was actually required was a whole systems approach and a whole systems examination and reform of debt advice and money advice in Scotland.
Yes, if I can come in. I agree, we need to look at the whole of kind of debt advice. With debt advice, options are probably the easiest part of the process. The most important part is the financial statement, getting that accurate and sustainable, because then after that, once you know what the client can afford and what their future needs holds, options are the most easiest part. But I would agree, you know, we see time and time again people coming in that have gone into a protected trust deed. When we've actually sat down with them and did a proper financial statement, there was no way that they should have been into a protected trust deed, but they'd be maybe paying for a year of contributions, and then they end up getting out of the protected trust deed, but getting back all their debt. Not any of that money that they've paid for a year has gone towards their debt. And in my personal opinion, I don't see protected trust deeds benefit anyone apart from those that can't enter bankruptcy due to employment reasons, because we see them being missold time and time again. And I think it is we have to look at how to fund frontline money advice to make sure that everyone gets presented with all viable options so that clients can make an informed decisions. When you are looking at individual options and incentivising through fees, of course, they will Some companies will push them towards it, but that's not what money advice should be. It should be about getting the right option for that client so that they can get out of debt relief, but maintain and keep in control of their finances so that they don't get back into debt in the future. But at the moment, you know, that keeps on happening, especially around the trust deeds. You know, I work for a local authority and you see lots of them coming in for rent arrears, but they get back straight into rent arrears straight away because they've not been left with enough money to live on, but they're paying their contribution to their trust deed. So I would welcome a full looking into all the debt options that we can look at, and how to fund it, but not through specific debt options.
And what would be the best vehicle to take that whole systems review approach, do you think?
I suppose we've got the Financial Conduct Authority levy coming in that's now been devolved to ourselves, and there has also been a suggestion put forward by some of my colleagues about a statutory debt option levy. I think there was a figure of, how much was that, sorry, Alan?
4 million at the moment. And taking a percentage of that. So, sorry, yeah, I mean, at the moment, the idea is to create a Scottish Debt Advice Levy as another complement to the Financial Conduct Authority's Debt Advice Levy, and that would be levied on formal debt solutions, all solutions at a percentage. At the moment, last year, I believe it was about 74 million was distributed to creditors through formal debt solutions, and that's after the accounting bankruptcy and private insolvency practitioners and payment distributors took tens of millions of pounds of fees. Now, the free money advice sector play a huge role in that delivering those solutions and helping people and helping them when they're in the solutions if things go wrong. But we took nothing from it. We got zero. But you know, creditors, accounting insolvency practitioners, and accounting bankruptcy took tens of millions. And it's ironic that we're actually, you know, suffering a major funding crisis, but £74 million is going out. And I think, you know, the idea is rather than having a levy on one solution, which could lead to incentivisation, you know, and creating perverse results, as Yvonne has suggested, what we do is put a levy on all solutions, so that funding can be given to advice services, possibly through the same body that I think is administering the Financial Conduct Authority levy for the Scottish Government, which is actually, I believe, the consumer unit of the Scottish Government. And they could give that to advice agencies, and advice agencies would get that money regardless of whether they're doing trustees, bankruptcies or debt arrangement schemes. You know, regardless of the demographics of their local area, they would get the money because they're helping people in that area, providing the right options. And that was an alternative solution I've suggested.
I wondered if Miss McDermott or Miss Holmyard had anything further to add.
No. It just, you know, we're certainly supportive of a Scottish debt levy, because what we have in the system at the minute isn't enough. And as Alan pointed out, you know, the Foreman Money Advice Service, when they looked at the figures, 50% more people need debt advice than currently are able to seek it, and that's down even to all the work that's been done by other agencies to upskill. Step Change, for example, investing in a transformational programme, and we're still not cutting it. And clearly, this is us at the beginning of a journey, I think, in a way. It's going to get worse. There's nothing to suggest it's going to get any better anytime soon. And we need to address that, and it needs to be adequately funded, and it needs to be done quickly to be able to respond, whilst we've still got the expertise in the sector, because many people have left just down to complete fatigue in their job. And we are very concerned as an organisation about the well-being of the money advisors, because if they don't stay well, they can't possibly give debt advice. So we need to be thinking about the much wider issue than just the delivery of the service itself, but the people who actually deliver it.
And Mr. Holmyard, you touched upon, you know, the need for a wider systems approach earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that my colleagues have already said in terms of, you know, the funding needs to be looked at. We are going through a funding crisis, as I said already, in our network. So you've got how the service is actually delivered, and then you've got the set of options, you know, that are available to use. And if you look at the set of options that we have, some of them actually aren't fit for the modern economy either. You know, if we look at something like people working in the gig economy, whose income varies up and down. Most of our debt solutions are based on somebody having a standard standard financial statement with an outcome, a set outcome, a constant outcome, and that's just not the case for a lot of people anymore. So, you know, we need to actually have a look at all the debt solutions to actually see if they're fit for purpose and who they should be aimed at. And you know, it's something that we need to actually, as an advice community, have a bit of input into, rather than, for example, the accounting and bankruptcy, as they currently do, coming up with a set of changes and then, you know, changing one thing at a time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Jackie Bailey?
With the Financial Conduct Authority levy just for a minute, because obviously the distribution of that money is devolved to Scotland last year. Do you know how much in Scotland the sum of money is that would be distributed?
I believe the figure at the moment, it's going to vary from year to year, but I believe the figure at the moment is about 3.96 million.
Yeah.
Yeah, we thought it was going to be 4.6, but it's now 3.96, I think, for this year. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what it'll be
And
for next year.
have they decided, I mean, the recommendations were made by the Tackling Debt Working Group. Have we decided what's to happen with that money?
Well, I believe and Yvonne can, sorry, I'm sort of jumping in, Yvonne could maybe answer this as well, but I believe what's going to happen is in September, the money is going to be given to the Scottish Legal Aid Board, who currently will provide funding to the free sector. They're currently providing the funding, because previously the money from the debt advice levy went to the Money Advice Service, and they gave it to the Scottish Legal Aid Board to distribute to the free sector. I believe it's now with the Consumer Protection Unit of the Scottish Government, and they're going to give it to the Scottish Legal Aid Board, but I believe the Scottish Legal Aid Board are currently rewriting the eligibility criteria as to who will get the funding and what the funding will be used for, and that will be announced this month. And I believe also that the Scottish Government's planning and announcing its Scottish debt roadmap this month as well, and I'm just hoping it's not going to be a road to nowhere, personally.
Okay. Don't start me singing. On the basis that it sounds like a very complicated set of arrangements for what is just under 4 million? Okay. Yvonne McDermott?
Yeah, I would agree, but it's probably better than what we had before, because at least it's now one grant agreement and not a whole series of grant agreements. Okay. So great efforts have gone into trying to consolidate, so it makes it easier from that point of view, but we are very hopeful that there will be 3-year agreements going forward, because 1-year agreements, and in some cases we've had 6 months, it just does not work. You need to have that whole sense of longevity, and you don't have that when you're operating on 1-year agreements, because people go into post, they set up a project and it's just set up and then they're vacated the post. So I think what we're looking at in the Tackling Problem Debt Group, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly around the workforce strategy, and we've been asked to deliver 2 pieces of research which hopefully will inform going forward, and we're in the midst of that at the minute, so we hope to have that research ready by the autumn, and that should, we believe that should help inform greatly how things should move forward, alongside, as Alan was saying, the route map.
Okay, let me move on to a question for step change in particular, because it's been suggested that the proposals before us in the regulations will lead to a consolidation of DAS provision, and there'll be maybe, you know, a few big providers. I'm interested in what you think the likely consequence will be for step change.
We applied to become a payments distributor so that we could support our clients right through the process, so that we give advice to our clients, then we support our clients right through the payments distribution process and continue to give them advice. When initially this step change became started to offer DAS to our clients, we had to pass our clients on to another payments distributor, and that caused confusion. So from our perspective, the ability to take the client from the start right through to the end and support them through the whole process is actually helpful. And that's what's good from being a continuing money advisor. At the moment, there are only 4 providers under the current tender. And one of those providers has actually withdrawn from taking any new cases. So there is only 3 providers currently being able to provide payment distribution for the whole sector in Scotland, and it's done on a sort of taxi rank basis. So when one of the 3 money advisor organisations, whether it's a CAB or a local authority money advisor, submits their case, then it's automatically selected for them which money payment distributor is next in the line. and then the case would then maybe come to us if we're the next in the line. But we retain all our cases for our own clients.
Okay, but it is the case that you will now receive, instead of an 8% fee, a 20% fee.
We will, yes.
And if you like, the pipeline of people coming to you is generated by people working for free.
Well, not necessarily, because at the end of the day, no, not necessarily,
Okay.
because at the present moment, the client or the money advice organisation would have to select us for the case to come to us or to any payment distributor. They could choose the accountant in bankruptcy as their default option if they so wished.
So it's not a taxi rank, you can select.
Yes, going forward, that's the proposal that you would select. At the present moment, it's a taxi rank because it's under a tendering process.
Do you think it's reasonable to leave it to chance or a negotiation whether you pass any of the 20% fee to the free money advice sector?
Well, from my perspective, and morally as a charity, we would be passing a part of the contribution back to the money advice sector.
I understand you're saying that, but are the other distributors governed by the same morals and ethics that you are?
No,
Okay.
they're not, and it's not clear within the regulations whether that is the case, although it's implied in the explanatory note that the payment distributor could pay some of the their fee back to the money advice organisation, but it's not explicit.
Okay, I'm a great believer. If that's what you want, you should put it on the face of the legislation.
I'm not disputing that.
Yeah.
Can I say that's the issue for us as Citizens Advice Bureau Network? I have one Citizens Advice Bureau that does 87 DAS cases last year, and I've got others that have done one. And you know, the rate that potentially the bureau that does 87 cases would get back from a payment distributor would be different to the rate that the one would get. Because you know, there's obviously commercial interests in there. You give me more cases, I give you more commission back, and it sounds like commission, doesn't it? Which again, it sits uncomfortably. So, as a network, we don't particularly want to be in the position of having to negotiate with Step Change and all the other payment distributors about what we're going to get back. Furthermore, the payment distributor doesn't actually have to take on the case, so it's a commercial decision for them. So we could be in the position where we have some low value debt payment plans where we have to look around for a payment distributor that's willing to take it on, and you know, at a reasonable rate, if you like. And apart from that, we also have to then enter into discussion with the client to say, here's the choices of payment distributors, and by the way, this one is paying us 10% for doing this one's paying us 15% for doing this. Which one do you want to choose? For a choice that actually doesn't mean anything to them, because they are still going to pay the same amount, they're still going to pay back 100% of their debt. It's us that are benefiting, not them. Okay. So we're really uncomfortable with this set of choices, you know, in terms of our independence and impartiality. As far as we're concerned, the current system actually works quite well for us in that we have no choice. The taxi rank system, you know, as far as we're concerned, actually works for us just now.
Sure.
And we'd be happy to continue it.
Okay. Just so that I'm clear, this committee can't amend regulations. Many of the respondents in evidence have called for a separate fee to be set out in regulations for that free money advice. If we do that, you're calling for the regulations to be withdrawn. Is that correct?
Yeah, can I come in this bit? I'm calling it, and it's with some reluctance that I'm calling for them withdrawn, because I don't know how long it will take for them to be reviewed and brought back. But if I can point out that since the debt arrangement scheme, and I've, like Yvonne, has been involved with it from the beginning, since the debt arrangement scheme has been brought in, we've had regulations in 2004, 2007, 2009, they were withdrawn in 2009, 2011, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2018, now we're going for 2019. And what there be, some people are suggesting is we should we know there's lots of things wrong with them, we know there's going to be lots of unintended consequences, but let's just put them in anyway. So we're going to be back here in 2021, because we're trying to run a service here, and if they're constantly changing the regulations, and I think this is, you know, this is one of the whole issues, that it's unintended consequences that keep arising out of these regulations. They keep coming back to them. So I think if these regulations aren't fit for purpose or they're badly drafted, they should not be passed, because we've got to stop doing this, but we cannot keep changing or adapting to new regulations all the time.
Is that the view of everybody on the panel? Okay, I would like to hear what Step Change's view is.
So, from our perspective, these regulations actually benefit clients. They actually help clients where they're in difficulty. The actual other changes, I appreciate the payment distribution issue is an issue, but actually the other changes within the regulations will maintain people in actual payment programmes and allow them to continue with their programmes, which currently we know around about a quarter of our clients will fail at some point within the lifetime of their DPP because they'll miss payments. And these regulations does give that support for sustainability.
I think, in fairness, the other members of the panel acknowledge that right from the outset.
I know, and I acknowledge their point too.
So I just want to push it a little.
Yeah, go on.
Do you think that the issue of payment for free debt advice is actually resolved by these regulations?
Well, at the present moment, the free debt advice don't get any money from the
Well, they
creditors
don't from
at
this.
all. No, at the present moment, they get nothing. So
They don't
from this process, that in theory, if the accountant in bankruptcy is the payment distributor and is giving them money back, then they will get some money back.
But there's nothing on the face of the regulations that says that.
No, I know that, but that's because it's been dealt with by a consultation, which is being done separately. So
And it hasn't been completed.
Well,
Okay.
it finished on the 16th of August, but the results have not been made formal yet. But I mean, I understand the issue. From our perspective, we are a winner from this. This process will allow the Step Change Debt Charity to be able to fund our money advice element of what we're providing for our clients. It will also be able to do that for other organisations. And I agree with you, on the face of these regulations, it most certainly does not make it clear that the free sector is getting money back.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. There's a further question I want to ask, which is, if these regulations do come into force, do you think they should apply to current cases as well as new ones, or simply ones that start from the point the regulations came into force?
I think I may have raised this issue. First of all, there's currently about 7,000 cases being administered by free sector money advisors, and with that I mean Citizens Advice Bureaus, local authorities and independent advice centres that return on average between £15 to £20 million a year to creditors. So that's 7,000 cases returning 15 to 20 million a year to creditors. I believe Step Change has possibly got an existing caseload about 3,500 at the moment, but you're only getting 8%, which you say isn't enough to obviously cover your costs. If we do apply these fees, I think it's imperative that it's not retrospective legislation. We can't obviously charge for things that have been done in the past, but I think they need to be applied to the existing cases going forward, because these cases are returning money to creditors. If we want to safeguard these cases, if we want to make sure that protect our duty of care, fulfil our duty of care to these clients and make sure that they continue to get money advice services and return money to creditors, these cases have to be funded. And as we gave evidence earlier before, the reality is the money is not there. We don't have the services we had. We don't have the capacity we had 4 years ago or 5 years ago. So if we want to see these £15 million, £20 million going back to creditors, and these 7,000 cases continue to hopefully continue successfully complete, that has to be funded. And one way of doing that is to apply these fees. Now, some people may raise an issue about whether you can do that or whether that's fair to the creditors because you're changing the terms and conditions. All I would point the committee to is in 2007, the interest and charges in the debt arrangement scheme was frozen, and it was also applied to all existing cases. At that point, we used a variation process to do it, which we could use for this, where we would change the terms and conditions through a variation. The creditors get an option to actually agree or disagree, and then it goes to a fair and reasonable test to object, and they also have a right to appeal to the court on the point of law. So there is a process that would allow these terms and conditions of existing cases to be changed, to allow the fees to be changed, and there's a precedent to say that's happened before in terms of fees and interest and charges.
May I ask, is this a make or break issue for you then, or not really?
As for me, because I think everything's make or break at the moment. I can't express strongly enough how serious a situation that the free debt advice sector in Scotland's in. I think we're on our knees, and I don't think we're going to break maybe in the end of this financial year, but it's coming. So this to me is a life and death issue for the free sector. We need funding.
So if the regulations were put into force, it would help you on that
Yes,
level?
as I've said, I think my submission, it's not my preference. My preference would be a Scottish debt advice levy, but I'll take anything I can get. So if I could get these regulations where the cases apply to the current cases, then I'll take it. It's not my ideal solution, but I'll accept it. If that's all we're getting, or that's all what's available at the moment, we'll take it. But my preference would be a Scottish debt advice levy.
But if it applied to new cases and didn't apply to old cases,
Not in the present format. I would ask these regulations are rejected at the moment because I think there's going to be unintended consequences. I think there's going to be
No,
mis-selling.
I understand that,
Yeah.
but if they're put into force for cases moving forward, that would assist financially.
No, it's going to take years. I mean, the amount of cases that we are doing, you know, we're not a big, we've not got the funding that other organisations have got. That will take us years to basically generate an income that's actually meaningful. At the moment, if these are just applied, it's absolutely meaningless to us. This fee at the moment, it will take years for us to actually, or any individual Citizens Advice Bureau, to build up enough revenue from this for it to make any meaningful.
All right, I see others nodding. Do you want to come in on that? I think, Angela, you were nodding. And do you have a comment to make on that?
You know, I would just concur with my colleague Alan McIntosh. You know, DAS is one of the options that my service offers because it can be a great solution in the right circumstances. Not everybody has disposable income that can repay back their debts in a reasonable period of time, and that is what needs to be for the client to be able to enter the DAS. You know, lots of our clients have not got enough money to look at doing that and have to look at insolvency options. So probably at the moment we've probably got about, I think, 55 active DAS cases. The majority of our work is negotiating write-offs or bankruptcies and just trying to keep people maintaining their priority debts, like their rent and council tax, to keep the roof over their heads. As I say, there's lots of great things in this regulations. It's just the payment and distribution fee not containing a money advice fee, and maybe we need to take a step back and look at the wider funding of all debt advice in Scotland, because my concern is about incentivising. You know, we know what's happening in the protected trust deed, and if we're trying to get things right for clients, it's about making sure there's enough funding so that options are presented in a holistic way, so the client is choosing what the right option is for them. And having fees attached to different options, I don't think that for some organisations they will be pushing them to that option, which is not what money advice is all about, or should be about.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to questions from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mira. There have been concerns raised about the additional work that's being placed on advisors in having to support a client to choose a payment distributor. Now, firstly, do you think these are valid concerns? Do you share these concerns? And maybe you can elaborate a wee bit on it.
Yeah, if I could jump in here. As a Citizens Advice Network, we value our independence and our impartiality. So if we're now in a situation where we have a series of multiple payment distributors who our client can choose from, we have to tell them about that. But not only do we have to tell them about that, we have to also tell them about how we benefit from the process. So, you know, if one payment distributor is paying us money back, we'll need to declare that. There's no ways as an independent network that we couldn't, tell people that important bit of information so that they have informed choice about what they're doing. So we're creating a step which currently we don't have. Okay, currently, as Sharon's alluded to, it works like a taxi rank. When we apply for a case, the payment distributor is applied automatically. Now we're talking a client through a series of payment distributors after already having gone through a long process of giving them debt advice to get to this point that they've chosen the debt arrangement scheme, and then saying, oh, by the way, you have another choice to make now. A choice that won't affect you, but will affect us in terms of how much money that we get back. Here's the list, here's the likelihood that they'll accept you or not, given the level of payment that you're making. Which one do you want to choose? And at that point, they choose somebody, we go approach that payment distributor and then find out that they're not prepared to take on the case because it's not commercially viable to them. That does sound like a lot of extra work.
So are you saying you're having to maintain a database
absolutely
of other providers in order to be able to provide that comparison?
Absolutely.
To the person.
The accountant and bankruptcy have said to us that they would maintain a list of who the payment distributors were on their website, but we have to go beyond that and say, what are the commercial arrangements? Apart from anything else, we're not really in a good place to make commercial arrangements with anybody. We're a small provider of the debt arrangement scheme, but it's still significant enough in terms of numbers that it counts. So we're never going to get the best possible deals from commercial debt advice, commercial payment distributors anyway. So from our point of view, the current system works well in that the accountant in bankruptcy appoints the payment distributor. As far as I'm concerned, I'd be quite happy if they continue to do that in line with the increased funding that they're talking about, and they can make the commercial arrangements with all the other payment distributors, for the actual funding to go back to the money advice sector. And that means it's a smooth process. As far as we're concerned, we're dealing with the accountant and bankruptcy. We're not dealing with multiple payment distributors. It simplifies things for us.
Do members of the panel have any other views?
I would concur with what Mike has said. In terms of when people are coming for debt advice, they're very vulnerable, and it is a long process. And as Angela says, going through, the income and expenditure, and they're having to tell you things that they probably haven't told other people. So there is quite an emotional attachment to this when people are in debt advice. So trying to keep it as simple as you can for people, and keep it that way, that should produce a better result than actually having to get into all the nuances of commercialism about what one provides and what another provides. So I think it's really important we keep it simple for people because they're already under a lot of stress.
From our perspective as a payment distributor, the converse is also true. So in as much as if we're providing this service for a Citizens Advice Bureau in the Highlands, we would have a contract potentially with that bureau. And then do we have one with the Glasgow Union? And do we have one with... So from our perspective, we could end up with multiple different, potentially, contracts or agreements between ourselves and multiple agencies. I mean, at the moment, I think there's over 70 organisations who provide DAS at the present moment. So we could end up with 70 different agreements or contracts in order for them to use us as a payment distributor, if they so wish to use us as a payment distributor. Now, we could have a set rate, we could have a varying rate, and likewise, every other payment distributor who became available could have varying rates for different organisations. So, even from our perspective, this change, for that aspect of this change, could cause difficulties.
Sorry, I just want to add, Mr. Beattie, that if we were to do what Mike's suggesting, it's going to require legislative change because it's in the legislation, the regulations at the moment. It's a consumer who chooses who the payment distributor is. The payment distributor works for the consumer. And at the moment, they have to use the tendering process. If these regulations comes in, then I'm assuming the consumer has to be given the choice to who the payment distributor is going to be. So if we want to change that, we're going to have to change the regulations because it's currently the payment distributor works for the consumer and it's their choice as far as I understand once these regulations go through. And what we could end up with, and Sharon mentions in her submission about how the cost of a procurement process, well, we're a local authority. I mean, are we going to have to do a tendering process for payment distributors to be fair and equal? But technically, we're not really procuring a service because it's actually the consumer that's procuring the service. So it is messy, and you could end up with this being multiplied time and time again rather than having one sort of procurement exercise. But I think that it would definitely require legislative change because at the moment, the payment distributor works for the consumer.
Given the multiple choice that the consumer is going to have to make, because presumably you have to take a neutral stand on this and just make the information available and it's up to the consumer, how easy is it for the consumer to make that decision? Are they easily comparable? Or is it a bit like other agreements?
It's, from the consumer point of view, they'll just see a list of names. Some of these aren't household names. A few of them are. Step Change is quite well known as a debt charity. Potentially there'll be other players like Christians Against Poverty and that kind of thing. So I think people will just make decisions based on their own personal biases. I like the sound of that rather than that. And you know, from a CAB point of view, we're not going to want to point anybody in any particular direction because we don't want to, you know, undermine our own impartiality.
I think what I'm really trying to get at is how easy is it for the consumer to make an informed choice based on the information you're making available to them?
I don't think it's going to be that easy, and apart from anything else, the choice isn't going to be meaningful for them because they're still going to pay back the same amount anyway. The service is the same that they're getting. They're paying back 100% of their debt. What's different is what's coming back to the advisor or the advice agency.
Just as a problem, and I'm using aside, the reason we have this problem is because the regulations, I believe, were changed in 2013, or was it 2014, to say that the payment distributor works for the money advisor, or the payment distributor works for the client. And the reason the regulations were changed was because it was realised that the payment distribution service was a vatable service. So they believed if they changed the regulations to say that the payment distributor works for the client, then it would be exempt for VAT, as debt management plans are generally exempt for VAT. I don't think that's actually the case. I don't think it worked out the way. But it's just an example of unintended consequences of tweaking the legislation. That's why we're in this situation, because they changed it in 2013 to try and get rid of VAT, basically.
Just to move on to something else. Conflicts of interest. Do you have any concerns about conflicts of interest if the Accountants in Bankruptcy acts as a payment distributor, given their multiple hats?
The obvious conflict of interest, again, I know I keep speaking, but I feel very passionate about this, but the obvious conflict of interest is they're also the regulator of payment distributors, so they have to go to Step Change, they'll have to go to Karen Dean, they'll have to go to ThinkLink and regulate their payment distributors. And how do they go to these companies and say, you're not meeting your KPIs, if they're not meeting their own KPIs? How do they do that? Because surely the payment distributors would turn around and go, well, you're wanting to talk because you're not meeting your KPIs. So it's very hard for a regulator when you're in that market competing with these people and you're maybe not meeting your own targets to go and tell somebody you're not meeting your targets.
So do you believe there is a conflict of interest
Absolutely,
there?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the areas that have been highlighted that in AIB's role is provider, regulator, policy generator, government advisor, and you know, on the surface, they do seem to have areas that could overlap and cause some difficulties. I'd be interested in your views on that.
I think it's important that in any of these roles that it's set out clearly what the Chinese walls are. There's already the case, you've got supervision in AIB and you've also got enforcement, if you like, at the others, and it's about ensuring that you can actually separate out these roles. And I think that if that is done correctly, then the conflict of interest, and I don't disagree with the principle of what Alan's saying, you know, if they're going to be the regulator and also being a payment distributor, but it would probably be a payment distributor of last resort. So people will make choices, and if they go to Step Change, the likelihood is they'll obviously use Step Change, or if there are other providers come along. But I think it's important that that's all set out clearly about what the roles are and the respective roles as a regulator, but also as a payment distributor themselves.
Can I take it from what you're saying at the moment that these roles are not adequately set out at the moment, and that the Chinese walls are not in place?
Well, they're not a payment distributor at the moment, so they have a system whereby people tender to get the contract, and then they're appointed on the basis of fitness on a number of different aspects of their business to make sure that they can deliver the service and deliver it well. And I think you mentioned earlier about, you know, a payment distributor not taking any more cases. Just a couple of years ago, what actually happened was one of the companies folded, and that was a big issue when it came to actually having a payment distribution in place. So I think it is important that we have a, if you like, a fail-safe, something that is there that isn't commercial, because the rest are either commercial or charitable.
What would that?
Sorry, if I can agree with that as well. You know, the AIB as payment distributor of last resort, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial for ensuring that there's an independent option for somebody. I totally accept that there are issues, particularly about how the AIB does this work, and there could be a conflict of interest. There is a precedent already in a couple of bits of legislation. For example, the AIB can review their own decisions. that they make in regard to the debt arrangement scheme and they make in regard to bankruptcy. They have the power to do that, and that's the first point that you would go to. You know, if you disagreed with a decision, you have to go through the review process first, but then what backs that up is a share of court process, where if you're unhappy with the review decision, then you can go to the Sheriff Court to have it explored there. So there is currently a system of Chinese walls within the AIB so that they can do the processing of the work and review their own decisions. It does exist, but I don't think I can make any comments as to the fitness of that because I've not experienced it myself.
From our perspective, the payment distributor has to be regulated by the FCA. So the client does have another recourse. They can complain to the FCA and they can investigate anything that we are doing as a payment distributor. And that's one of the conditions for any new payment distributor going forward under the legislation, that there's been no guidance or instruction from the accountant in bankruptcy yet on what that would look like. As our colleagues on the panel have said, at the present moment under the tender, we are required to provide evidence of what we do. We have to comply with certain conditions in order to ensure that payments are met and distributed within a timely manner. And, you know, we have to report on that regularly to the accountant in bankruptcy. But we're not clear yet what would happen if a client was going to the accountant in bankruptcy as a payment distributor, who they would complain to or what recourse they would have.
So, yeah, in relation to that point, I did notice that in Sharon's submission, which I thought was quite surprising, because as a former head of policy for the accountant in bankruptcy, I thought she would know that you go to the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman. And there has been decisions by the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman in relation to payment distributions previously, up to now, and they're published.
The draft regulations also introduce a number of administrative changes that make it arguably easier to administer DAS. For example, the proposal to approve an application of less than 10% of creditors, object the short-term crisis payments that have been mentioned. Do you broadly agree with these, or are there other issues you want to put on the table in regard to those provisions?
Support the introduction of the short-term financial crisis payment. As I mentioned earlier, we think that's hugely positive for people because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the evidence, people's lives are not linear. You know, they will have peaks and troughs, and we need to be able to help accommodate that and do it quickly, swiftly, because going through a whole administrative system all takes time, and the crisis is past, or they've gone for a payday loan, they've not been able to access affordable credit. So I think it's really important. And the automatic approval process as well, that will go some way to alleviate the administrative burden that we've talked about quite a lot today, about the advisors and the amount of work that they have to do. So I think anything that we can make things happen quicker and easier means that the advisors will hopefully then be able to see more clients, which should help reduce the burden of, and you know, we can improve the supply of debt advice rather than getting tangled up in administrative burdens.
So it seems to me, as a number of my colleagues have alluded to earlier, Jackie Bailey was talking about this earlier, that there are many things in these regulations that are good and welcome. There are some that are problematic, and there are different views amongst different stakeholders. As Jackie Bailey said, this is subordinate legislation. We can't amend this. We can only invite the government to withdraw it or formally recommend Parliament reject it or approve it, etc. I mean, and we will obviously be reflecting on the evidence we've heard and come to a view as to what we wish to recommend to Parliament, or indeed engage with ministers further over these draft regulations. But if you were in our shoes, would you be recommending Parliament approve these regulations, or would you be recommending that they reject them?
I would recommend that you approve them, because I think this is for the benefit of the consumer in Scotland, and they're already suffering, you know, through their over-indebtedness. and what's in these regulations, not perfect by any manner of means, but what it offers in terms of the short-term financial crisis break and the administrative burden being lifted, I think will go some way. It's not going to go the whole way, but I do feel that we could be throwing the baby out with the bathwater here if we lose these regulations, and it will put us back the way. I acknowledge what Alan has said about all the different changes, but I think that has been attempts to try to get it right, and that it's not perfect, but this is at least, it's the start of a discussion around the funding of debt advice, which we haven't had really for an awful long time in any constructive way, and it'll certainly get everyone thinking, but I would be concerned if these are rejected.
I should have added, sorry, that we can go back to the Minister and make some suggestions for some probably fairly modest changes, invite the government to agree with them and retable. So it's not absolutely a question of reject, and I think we do have some flexibility in that regard.
I think I've actually, in my submission, made a suggestion that if these were to be passed, and I think there has to be changes. I think I suggested they should be applied to existing cases. Yep. I believe there has to be a money advisor, there's more transparency in the fee structure, and I think that's basically the change that I think would make it acceptable, palatable to me. But other than that, I would reject them, because I would say don't reward bad behaviour, and do not do it, because do not pass bad legislation, because we have had it 2004, 2007, 2009, 2013. I can go on and on, I've done it already. We don't need to keep making mistakes. We've got to stop making unintended consequences. We can't keep unpicking this, because we're tweaking the things, and what we need is a wholesale review, advice, funding, and that's what's more important. Do not make mistakes and pass this. I don't know what reward bad behaviour, and I think passing this legislation would do that.
Understood.
I think I would say, it's a shame that we're at this point, given that there was a lot of support for the changes to be made, and that some of us sat on the DAS regulatory working group. But the point that we've now arrived at is that we've got some regulations that are really going to be helpful for consumers, as my colleagues have already said, that are going to actually make it a lot easier to do the DAS process. So going on your last comment there, I would say, this is what the flexibilities that these regulations introduce into the process, the reduction of bureaucracy is very welcome. And so if they were to resubmit these regulations with those flexibilities, I think you would find broad acceptance from the sector. It's this funding issue and how it's derived from the DAS that is the problem, and that issue needs to be talked about in more depth, and as my colleagues say, also the whole funding of the free debt advice sector. So if you were to resubmit these regulations just with the flexibilities that they introduced, then I'm sure that would be welcomed.
From our perspective, we most certainly would have to support that. It's the other regulations, not Regulation 4, that we're completely supportive of, categorically, because they are for the benefit of the client, without shadow of a doubt.
Okay. I see Angela nodding her head. She's agreed with...
often, clients come to you and they've got the income shock, and trying to apply for a payment holiday takes too long. And by that time they've missed a payment, and then that's recorded against their file. So the emergency payment, I think, is brilliant. Really glad they've actually introduced this. And some of the other administration things is just common sense. Like when you're looking to increase the amount paid back to creditors, it should be automatically approved. Why are we waiting for a process to happen when the client just wants to start paying more to get their debts paid back? So I would agree with all my colleagues here. It's the payment distributor fee, Regulation 4, that seems to be the most contentious area and needs to be explored further to make sure we do get it right.
Okay, thank you.
So can I just be clear? I mean, there may be other things here and there that you're not entirely happy with in the regulations, but if Regulation 4, if that were amended and adjusted to take on board these points, you would all be in agreement with the regulations being approved, as it were? Is that I think you're all nodding, so you all agree with that. If you don't, please speak or forever hold your peace. Right, Gordon MacDonald.
We've talked a lot about the impact of these regulations on the industry itself and consumers and debtors. And I just want to ask what you think the impact on creditors would be. Under the current scheme, we have 100% of the debt is paid, and creditors know that they're going to get 90% of that funds over, say, a 6 or 7 year period. Under these regulations, that's going to drop to 78% of the funds. And I'm just wondering if, you know, what the likely response from creditors is going to be on that.
Ms McDonagh, if I can start. First of all, obviously, I want to address the point that some people in their submissions have said that this makes the debt arrangement scheme more a type of insolvency than a debt management solution. I just want to say that's not actually true. Let's remember that the consumer, even under these new regulations, will still pay 100 pence in the pound back. So this is not insolvency. What it just means is that the creditors are going to have to pay a bit more towards the costs to getting their debts back. And so that is not insolvency. And some people have suggested, maybe from their perspective, but at the same time, I think one of the reasons for these regulations and the 20% is it's quite normal for creditors to pay between 20 and 25% for debt recovery anyway. So therefore, that's why it's seen that this is a reasonable figure. The effect it will have on the creditors, obviously, is they'll get less money back. But there's another effect that will have a consequence of this is potentially with more money going into the free sector if it was applied to existing cases, is that for every pound that's spent on money advice services, free money advice services when it's under capacity, multiple research has shown it returns between £4 and £9 to the creditors. So what this will do, if it's done properly, is it will return more money to the creditors overall. It'll get more money back from them in the same way that the 7,000 cases that the free sector and Money Advice Scotland, Citizens Advice Bureaus are doing, is returning £15 to £20 million to creditors every year, and only about £11 million has been provided in funding through local authorities. It shows for every pound you spend, you will get more money back. So creditors may object to this over getting less money, but they're going to get more money back if the money's come back into the sector and been recycled into giving people advice.
Any other reason?
Yeah, I would just concur with what Alan has said. We know that money advice works. We know debt advice works. The minute there is a trusted intermediary, and very often a lot of the creditors, it's a case of if it's come from Step Change or it's come from CAB or local authorities, they'll sign it off using the Common Financial Tool. And so therefore they're happy to get at least something back. It might not be the whole lot, but they're, you know, because they all build that into the cost of debt purchase as well, and the cost of debt collection, as Alan says. So what would you not like about it when you're actually getting money back when you didn't get anything yesterday or the month before that? So I think there is a big debate going on in the industry at the minute because the Financial Services Levy, and you know, the chairman has called for an additional 100 million. So they're already under a lot of pressure to actually put more money into the system. But the other side of it is they know that they're going to get something back for that investment going forward in the future. So I think it's really important.
Okay. We received in written evidence from Christians Against Poverty saying that creditor buy-in is key for the smooth operational running of DAS, and it would be a risk that asking creditors to contribute more than 15% would lead to further disengagement from the credit industry. What is the risk of less cooperation and disengagement by creditors? And if that was the case, what impact would this have on...
Christian Against Poverty announced a couple of weeks ago they're not seeing any new clients until the new year because of lack of capacity. So, do you know what I mean? We unfortunately don't get the opportunity to just stop taking clients. But I think there is a risk that we won't get creditor buy-in. But I just want to make there's a risk also to services being under capacity where they can actually just halfway through the year decide they're not going to see any more clients for the rest of the year.
I think you have to look at it in the round again, and if you compare the returns for a protected trust deed, for example, which are between 10 and 15% roughly, you know, getting back 78% is a lot better, and the current market is totally biased towards protected trust deeds. It's the biggest selling debt solution, and you know, in Scotland. So. Against those returns, I think you'll find that a lot of creditors will probably be more willing to accept 78% rather than 15%.
Okay.
You also have to remember that when the proposals are sent to creditors, they do have the option to reject them or to make comments on the actual return. If they do reject it, the accountant in bankruptcy does have a fair and reasonable test. So if it is reasonable that the debt payment programme goes forward, then it will go forward, irrespective of maybe the personal bias or the comments of a particular creditor. So there is an opportunity for not only the money advisor to put forward more evidence, but also for the creditor to submit further evidence as to why they think that might not be the best proposal for them.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. Are there any further questions from committee members for this panel? If not, thank you very much. I'll suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses to the next panel. Thank you for coming in. Thank you. Well, welcome back to the committee. May I welcome the members on the second panel, and going from my left to right, first of all, Dermot O'Neill, who's the Chief Executive of the Scottish League of Credit Unions, Karen Hurst, who is Policy Officer of the Association of British Credit Unions, and David Menzies, who is the Director of Practice of ICA. So welcome to all three of you. And if I could start with a question. The accountant bankruptcy has said that these proposals should encourage, as I understand it, the expansion of the debt arrangement scheme. Do you agree with that?
We hope so. The challenge for credit unions is they operate in a restrictive legislative environment where the interest rate they charge on loans is capped by law. So by default, we operate within a artificially narrow margin of profitability, and with the increase of loan write-offs, the sustainability of credit unions is challenging. The reality just now is that the increase in protected trust deeds places even further pressure on that profitability and therefore sustainability. So we support any change that where a debt solution is required, then a debt solution returns more to the creditor than is currently returned through protected trust deeds.
Other views or the same view?
Yeah, I would echo that. We've always supported the debt arrangement scheme. We think it's a good thing for Scotland. It's a good scheme for creditors. We think it's, for those who are appropriate for it, it's a good scheme for the debtors. As Dermot alluded to, the rise in protected trust deeds has probably been one of the biggest issues for our sector over the last few years. So I was part of the working group that formed this. I went along to that with an open mind, and I certainly heard feedback from colleagues in the free debt advice sector that there were some challenges around the bureaucracy, some challenges around funding the debt arrangement scheme as it was, irrespective of whether or not it grows. So therefore we are happy to support the regulations in their current form for that reason. I would just say that as part of the discussion we've been having around this going back a few years now, it was kind of had alongside a discussion around reforms to protected trust deeds, and we had hoped it would form part of a package, because I have some scepticism as to whether or not these changes in themselves is really going to make any difference. As someone alluded to in the first session, the returns for the person handling a debt arrangement scheme is debatable, but the sort of fees taken would be 22% in this scheme. With protected trust deeds, sometimes it's up to 90% is going in fees. So quite clearly, the drivers that are behind the rise in protected trust deeds, I don't think are necessarily going to be addressed by this, which is the key issue. But nevertheless, we're happy to support these regulations.
I think again, we're very supportive of the government's process to have a range of debt management and debt relief solutions that's available. Whether these regulations themselves will increase capacity for debt advice, I think is perhaps debatable. I think you've heard in the previous session there around the capacity for the free debt advice sector. By all accounts, they are already at capacity or very, very near capacity. So therefore, the additional capacity that's going to be brought in through these regulations would seem to be suggested around the payment distribution fee and the Regulation 4 changes, with the hope that that would bring in additional commercial capacity, I guess, into the system. Whether that's the reality or not, I think we have some doubts around that, because the payment distribution plan will require the payment distributor to be authorised by the FCA, and that process is fairly time-consuming. Brings in another layer and burden of regulation over firms that already are regulated by the AIB, the likes of ICAS, etc. as well. So it brings in another layer there. My suggestion would be, I guess, those who are already or would want to do DAS, they already probably are FCA regulated and already do provide DAS advice as part of a range and suite of solutions. So therefore, the notion of bringing in additional capacity, I think, is perhaps questionable. There's certainly no evidence that that would be the case, and I think it would take certainly some time for that capacity to come into the marketplace. It's not going to be an overnight panacea to bring that in. The important thing, obviously, is not actually whether it's about access to DAS or protected trust deeds or sequestration. The ultimate thing, I guess, for both the creditors and the debtor is that they receive appropriate debt advice and end up in an appropriate solution, whatever that solution is and is right for them in those circumstances.
So may I just clarify, because I think in the ICAS submission comment was made that a more fundamental and overarching review of debt management and debt relief solutions in Scotland should be undertaken, and I think you made some criticism of the fact there's been quite a number of amendments to regulations over the previous 8 years. So your position is, though, that these regulations are a positive thing in spite of those comments in the submission?
I think in overall terms, yes. I mean, the positive regulations, there's a lot of things moving in the right step. As I think in our submission, you're correct. We did say, actually, probably this is about time to draw a line in the sand, take a fresh view, look at everything in the round. We've had 5 sets of DAS regulations in the last 8 years. You add into that all the tweaks that we've had to protected trust deeds, the changes to the bankruptcy system and all the rest of it. All of this is coming together, but in a bit of a disjointed manner, which kind of leads a bit of some unintended consequences around that. I think there's a bigger societal question, I guess, that we need to ask, which is around what do we want debt relief and debt management solution to look like in Scotland? When is it appropriate and not appropriate to have some of those solutions, and what are the impact across housing policy, mental health issues, other health issues? None of that has really been brought together fully. And certainly over the last 20 years, 30 years, I guess, when you go back to the Bankruptcy Act of 1985, we've not really had that overarching view of legislative amendment and change. So, as absolutely, while we support much of what's in the regulations, I would like to see that this would probably be a pause after this stage, where we can actually take that view across society and across Scotland to see actually what does debt management, debt relief solutions actually look like.
All right, thank you. John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, maybe to continue kind of from that line of questioning, I mean, we've clearly got different organisations or different individuals involved in all of this. We've got the debtors, we've got the creditors, and we've got the payment distributors and the advice givers. I mean, the accountant bankruptcy does seem to feel and argue that it's more attractive for debtors to have more people in DAS than in protected trust deeds. Although I'm kind of picking up from you that you're not maybe convinced that that will cause a swing, because the suggestion that if the fees are 90% at the moment and they're only going to be 22%, that's maybe not hugely attractive. I mean, from the debtor's point of view, do these changes make much difference at all?
Actually, to me, from a debtor's perspective, they are paying the same amount, same contribution in whatever debt solution or debt management solution it is that they end up with. That's a decision that Parliament took around harmonising a lot of those procedures. I think again, that's something that we've ended up with. There's now, where you look across sequestration, bankruptcy, and DAS, there's very little real difference in the outcome for the debtor. They pay the same amount of contribution. The difference is whether they are absolutely guaranteed of a discharge of their debt or not. And the reality is, while I hear what the credit unions say and others say around protected trust deeds, the reality is that over a 4, 5, 6, 7 year period, life does change. People don't know what's going to happen in that period. So therefore, when they're presented with a solution which gives a certainty of debt write-off, whether or not they maintain their contributions or not, which you get in sequestration and trust deed, as opposed to a situation in DAS where if 4 years down the line you're not able to continue your contribution because of a change in personal circumstances, income shocks, whatever, yes, okay, you've paid down some of your debt, but you're still left with a rump of debt that you're unable to pay, and you're back to square one again. So that is the reality of why people will choose protected trust deeds or sequestration over DAS, and the regulations do not address that issue.
Okay, I'll come back to Ms Hurst just in a minute. I can see you both wanting to come in. I mean, I should have actually declared I'm a member of ICAS as well, which doesn't always mean I agree with all the ICAS statements. I mean, I don't know if you can speak for other creditors. I mean, clearly we've got the credit unions here, but I mean, a lot of your members, I would imagine, either are or work for creditors. Would it help them to have more people doing DAS rather than protected trust deeds?
I think in the reality, I mean, when you look at the whole value that's going into DAS, and then you spread that across all the creditors. Again, in the main, the vast majority of creditors are going to be large financial institutions, and the reality is, as long as the debtor ends up with a solution that's right for them, the value of the payback to them is perhaps less important.
Even if we were comparing 90% with 78%?
Yes.
Or sorry, 10% with 78%?
Yes, and I think you see that where there are very, very few objections to trust deeds where the average value of return on a dividend is 17 to 20%. So, if they're not objecting to that level of return, so absolutely they're not going to object to a 78% level of return, but their acceptance of a 17, 18, 19, 20p in the pound return is there because they understand that that's the right solution for the debtor to be in. They work with the trusted advisors, whether it be the free debt solution or with insolvency practitioners. They accept that we provide good quality, high professional advice, and if that's the most appropriate solution for the debtor to be in, that's the end result of it.
Okay, thanks. Ms Hurst, I think you were maybe not entirely agreeing.
Yeah, I completely disagree with David's point in that, I have to say. So one difference between obviously DAS and trust deeds is in DAS there's a requirement currently, and would be the case under these regulations, that the debtor has to pay back 100% of the debts that they owe. In trust deeds there is at least the ability for some debt write-off. What we are seeing increasingly is that the number of cases that could be either, but the difference is, and there was one case that came upon my desk recently. It was someone in a very low income, a single parent. The only income was sort of for part-time employment and benefits. The trust deed that would gain protected status from the AIB would involve them paying back £7,000 over 5 years, which is a significant undertaking on their part. One might say possibly not even realistic. The fees that were taken by the trustee was over £6,000. So after 5 years worth of £7,000 of payments, the creditors were only getting about £900 back in that. I feel as though if I was in that position and I was paying back £7,000, I would very much prefer that it was paying back my creditors and not paying the fees of a trustee who's using it basically to advertise for more people. And if you're in, as someone alluded to earlier this morning, if you're in a position where you know you're in problem debt, you need some advice, you don't really know where to go, the system is geared up so that you're going to end up in a trusted, because the biggest firms in Scotland are advertising extremely aggressively at the moment. It's Facebook, TV. If you drive along the M8, there's a huge billboard. So I don't agree at all that it makes no difference. Just to also reference David's point about the lack of scrutiny of trust deeds, which is a huge bugbear of ours. You're right that at the moment most of the creditors are larger financial organisations, or they're certainly not credit unions. I wouldn't say that they are happy with this situation. They're not scrutinising it, but to say that they're happy and they're satisfied, to say that the creditor body is happy and satisfied that the insolvency profession is handling this professionally and in line with the law, it couldn't be further from the truth.
Are credit unions an unusual creditor in this whole scenario?
Yes, we tend to be a smaller creditor. effectively don't have a vote because a protected trust deed is, becomes protected according to a majority vote, unlike DAS. So it tends to never be, rarely is the case that the credit union has a say in this. I don't know much about how the banks operate, but I understand that they appoint representatives to vote on their behalf according to sort of certain criteria. So basically they're not scrutinising individual cases in the way that a credit union might. And as Dermot already says, we simply don't have the margins to kind of soak up this this level of loss, which is significant at this time.
Thank you. Mr O'Neill, did you want to come in?
Yeah, we agree entirely with Karen's position, and I guess just to support that, David referenced the value of a societal review of how we manage debt management, and I think if that was to take place, then we believe that those who can be supported to pay their debts should be supported to pay their debts. And our focus as a trade body for credit unions is primarily about protecting the creditor, then the debtor, and then the mechanism for the debt repayment comes last. To touch on Karen's point around the practices of insolvency practitioners, there was an issue recently in Glasgow and Parkhead Forge in East End of Glasgow where Carrington Dean turned up for the day dressed as a fluffy animal and spent the day buying people's messages and paying for products and suggesting that if anyone with money worries could have 75% of their debt written off if they engage with Carrington Dean services. That's an incredibly difficult space to put affordable credit providers like credit unions in. That if we are active in such communities and our ability to extend affordable credit is already squeezed, to then face an exploitative practice and preying on the most vulnerable people in society by suggesting that credit that was taken with was offered with good intentions by the credit union, that 75% of it could simply be written off by engaging an insolvency practitioner, makes it incredibly difficult for credit unions to continue to be active in that space.
Okay, I mean, seeing we're mentioning Parkhead, which happens to be in my constituency, I could probably also be worth mentioning that Parkhead Credit Union closed where I had some of my savings. But anyway, Mr Mingus, do you want to come back in and then... Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you know, we're obviously talking about the DAS regulations here and not about protected trust deed regulations, which may come further down the line.
I think one of my colleagues will come on to comparing the two.
Yeah, but I think perhaps just to answer back, I guess, in terms of the insolvency profession, I think it's important, I guess, for the committee to understand what that landscape looks like. You know, and certainly in terms of the protected trust deed side of things, you know, 69% of trust deeds are taken out by 3 providers in the UK. I would point out that none of those are regulated by ICAS. You know, ICAS regulates around 13% of the trust deed market. So, you know, I do accept that there is, you know, perhaps practices that we would not necessarily support going on out there, but those are not going to be addressed by the DAS regulations.
Okay, I mean, you're arguing very much for a bigger review. Do you think we should drop these regulations in the meantime and just have a bigger review, or do we go ahead with the regulations and then do a bigger review later?
From my perspective, I would say, you know, there's a lot to be encouraged within these regulations. Therefore, I would probably support, you know, passing these regulations as they are. I think, you know, there are some other concerns that we have, but broadly, I don't think that they're so fundamental that, you know, the balance is wrong in them. As I say, I think, you know, things can be improved, but I would strongly encourage, I guess, that this is perhaps the last set of legislation that is considered by the Scottish Government until that big, wider review is carried out, yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener. We heard from Mr Menzies when he began to explore, I suppose, some of the pros and cons between protected trust deeds, sequestration, DAS. And committee has heard from some respondents who are concerned, or who have a particular concern, about the growing use of protected trust deeds. And I suppose I would just be really interested to know whether the panel felt that there are many debtors who enter protected trust deeds who would actually be better in the first instance going down the DAS route.
As I mentioned, I think sort of anecdotally from our members, for their sort of relationships with their members, they feel that people are not quite aware of the consequences of entering a trust deed. It's an insolvency solution, unlike the debt arrangement scheme. It's been, as Dermot says, that you can end up in it because you want to get your messages paid. Or there was a advert promoted to me on Facebook the other day that said scheme for Scottish mothers to write off all their debt, and it's really bringing in people that way. I don't think they're aware that entering a trust deed probably means they won't get a mortgage in a couple of years, or they might not be able to access credit in the same way that they have done to date. What I would also highlight is, obviously I've mentioned the high level of the difference in fees, which can range from sort of 90% in a trust deed to what it is currently, which is 10% or possibly 22% in DAS. In a trust deed, the fees come off first. So, and there's a particularly high failure rate in a trust deed. So, if you are in a trust deed for a year or two and you're making payments into that trust deed, and then it turns out it's unsustainable and it fails, what happens is those payments are just going to pay the fees of the insolvency practitioner. You're back to where you started. You still owe exactly the same amount, and you have no protection under the law from your creditors, because the ban on diligence only lasts as long as the trust deed lasts. In a debt arrangement scheme, because the fees are much lower, you might be paying the same amount, but if you can only pay into that and in 2 years down the line there's some kind of life shock and you can no longer sustain the debt arrangement scheme, you've paid off more of your actual debts, which I think is a big difference.
So before I turn to other members of the panel, if I can turn my question around, do you think there is anything in the regulations before us that would incentivise greater use of DAS over protected trust deeds, and whether that's always appropriate?
So as I said, I think I'm a wee bit sceptical that it would make a fundamental difference without substantial reform to trust deed legislation. In terms of the discussion earlier about whether or not it's appropriate to incentivise advisors to go down a DAS relative to maybe some other kind of solution that's not statutory, I mean, I would say firstly that's already what we have. The clear financial incentive is that to get people into trust deeds if we look at the landscape as a whole, but I'm not applying that kind of to every organisation. But in general, I kind of agree that it shouldn't be the case that it's seen as a kind of trade-off, as in you'll get that amount if you offer someone a DAS, or that amount if it's a trust deed or whatever. That's not ideal. I recognise that. The consultation which happened recently about how any money collected by the AIB as a result of these changes would be distributed, we have chosen not to sort of get involved in that, just because as creditors we want to see a well-funded free advice sector that's giving people the best possible solutions, whatever those solutions may be, without any kind of financial incentive. I don't think I know what that looks like, but I'd certainly support the overall outcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Menzies, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'd have to say I don't accept the point that Karen portrays around the insolvency sector and such like, and I think certainly the evidence is not there around that. So, when you look about, the suggestion that people are being put into trust deeds inappropriately, the evidence just doesn't stack that up at all. The latest statistics that we have from the Government Complaints Gateway suggests that in 2018 there were 11 individual complaints around trust deeds. And bear in mind that there's around 8,000 to 9,000 trust deeds signed per year. There are approximately 25,000 live trust deeds on the go at the moment. So the complaint rate is less than 0.2% of trust deeds. So that doesn't suggest that there are a lot of people either on the debtor side or the creditor side that are believing that people have been put into trust deeds
I just wondered,
incorrectly.
Mr. Menzies, I mean, I think the point about evidence is important, but it's also about how you get reliable evidence, and I'm not sure relying on complaints as opposed to a deep dive and a proportionate amount of actual real case studies. So is there evidence, I'll open this up to any of the panel, actual evidence based on, you know, an appropriate audit of a portion of cases, or, you know, something that's looking at more case review type material as opposed to relying just on, you know, a few complaints.
We support Karen's position entirely, and I think the context of that's important. APCO support just over 50% of the credit union sector in Scotland. We support just over 30%. We also have the mandate from Glasgow Credit Union, which is the largest credit union in the UK, and also ScotWest to support the recommendations of that. So that collective essentially means that the entire credit union sector broadly supports the regulations as proposed. I think the issue around complaints, again, context is important. Is it that the minimal level of complaints, as David's highlighted, is because of where in the pipeline those potential complainees are? Have they yet experienced the consequence of entering a protected trust deed? Or has that consequence still to be realised? Has the person yet exited the protected trust deed stage, and have they yet been rejected for a mortgage application or other affordable credit? So if the instance of complaints is currently low, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a problem brewing. I think also some feedback from ScotWest again, from the creditor perspective, they on average receive 92% return from DAS, as opposed to around 12.5% from a protected trust deed. So again, any move that improves the return to creditors would be supported by credit unions.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Beattie.
Convener. There's been concerns raised about the transparency in the process of setting the 20% fee in these regulations. Does the panel have a view on that?
I would say, as a creditor, when we were responding to the original consultation, I certainly felt I didn't necessarily, there was a couple of different options put forward, ranging from, I think, the current 10% up to the 22%, which I think was the maximum. I didn't feel there was adequate analysis of how they arrived at those figures. I have to say, I did feel as though I was being asked to sort of say, well, what could you afford to give up? Which is a wee bit of a sort of piece of string type question. It depends. And so I would say I was disappointed in that. But nevertheless, you know, we still think it's not an unreasonable figure that we've arrived at, given what, you know, all the other issues I've alluded to.
Do the other members of the panel have a view on that?
Again, we echo Karen's position. We believe that if the increase from 10 to 22% makes the provision of DAS schemes more sustainable to providers, or increases the provision of DAS schemes, then we think that that's a reasonable and necessary levy.
So would I be correct in sort of summarising and saying, yes, you agree there seems to be been a lack of transparency in the process of arriving at that figure, but the figure in itself you're comfortable with? Is that fair to say?
I'm willing to take a shot, yeah.
Okay. Do you see any advantages in having a separate money advice fee set out in the regulations?
A Scottish levy. Obviously that's not currently part of the regulation, so it's not something we as an organisation have explored with our members at this time. Obviously, as FCA regulated firms, credit unions have for some years contributed towards the FCA debt levy, which has been a matter of some frustration, just because a lot of firms, basically it applies to every firm who's within the FCA regime, which excludes a lot, well, consumer credit firms for one.
Can you remind me the level that's set at?
Sorry?
Can you remind me the level that's set at?
I don't know. I think it differs. I don't know. Do you know? I'm afraid I don't. Sorry. But it didn't, for a number of years, it didn't apply to consumer credit firms just because they weren't within the FCA regime, although that's now been resolved. I think we would welcome a discussion on that. I would be interested to know what it would mean. You know, was it in addition to what's currently taken in with regards to the FCA stuff, and also the other fees that credit unions face, you know, for example, fair share, that kind of thing. Would it be in addition to all that, or would it be the case that it simply became wholly devolved to Scotland, both at the collection and also at the distribution?
Do all panel members have a view on that?
We don't have a formal position on it.
You've never actually considered it?
No.
It's never been on the table formally, so we haven't now.
Sorry, if I understood the question correctly, I think what your question is whether the legislation should set out almost the split of the 20% between the payment distributor and the continuing money advisor. I think in terms of the regulations, I think it's pretty silent on that, and I think that was one of the points we made in our consultation response and our written evidence to the committee, was actually it's unclear as to whether there is going to be a second set of legislation coming forward which would govern how the payment distributor and continuing money advisor fee is split, or will that be set up purely under a whatever arrangement it is that the AIB wishes on that. So I think the regulations provide a framework for a 20% fee. I think how that's then split and everything else is unclear from the regulations, and I think that was some of the disadvantage of the regulations being brought forward while the consultation was still getting carried out on how the fee was going to be returned to the free debt advice sector. Those two need to be joined up a bit more.
Do you believe it should be specified?
I think it's helpful to have transparency and accountability around that, and say whether that is necessary in these regulations, another set of regulations, or whatever. I think will somewhat depend upon the outcome of the consultation response to how the funds are to be returned to the free debt advice sector. One of the options within that, for instance, was that the surplus from the AIB would go back into effectively central government funding. Now, if there's transparency around how that surplus is calculated and it's all just going back into central government funding, it's probably less necessary to have that in legislation, because what you're taking with one hand, you're giving back with the other, in terms of the block grant that goes back to the AIB. So that's why, again, I would say it would have been helpful if the regulations and the consultation on the return of funds to the free debt advice sector had a bit more conjoined end to them.
But what if down the line there is no specification as to how the split should be? Are we going to find variations in the market, or is it going to be, will the market regulate itself on that?
I think it is likely that there will be some degree of variation, but as with all market forces, there tends to be an equilibrium come to by the market. So I suspect at the end of the day, the end consumer, the debtor, will be faced with broadly the same split between continued money advisor and payment distributor, no matter who they end up with as the payment distributor.
Gordon MacDonald.
The panel, the earlier panel, seemed to say that creditors will just accept getting less money because it's better than any other scheme that currently exists. What do you think the impact on creditors will be of receiving less funds from DAS?
Your point is valid in that the alternative is so poor that even a reduction in the return from DAS is better than the alternative. So it's a reluctance acceptance that both parties benefit from an individual who has the potential or who has the option of a protected trust deed or a DAS. The outcome is better for both the debtor and the creditor under a DAS arrangement. Generally, the creditor receives more of a return, and generally the debtor makes more of a payment towards their debt. So again, if it's better to have more return from DAS, even if it's reduced, than the pittance that's returned to creditors from a protected trust deed.
Okay. Anybody else? No?
I could agree with that. It's important to note the scale. I think in the first 3 months of this year, the AIB said there had been about 2,000 protected trust deeds and about 500 DAS cases. So it's not the case that they're being, inundated with debt arrangement scheme cases anyway. So,
But the increase in fees, you reckon, might swing it the other way?
I don't think I necessarily agree with that, without fundamental changes to trust deeds. But at the moment, we're kind of comfortable with what's been proposed.
And the only other point I wanted to ask was, do you think that the increase in fees should be applied to existing cases?
So this is obviously not something that was part of these regulations, or indeed was consulted on. So I think we would need to discuss it. I mean, what I would say is creditors were asked to vote on each one of these cases, which they did according to what was put to them at the time. I'm not sure. I feel as though, I noted earlier there was a suggestion that perhaps it could be done through variations. Obviously creditors would have a say in that, so perhaps that would be one way of doing it. I think that it wouldn't feel particularly fair without at least engaging in them in that discussion. I know that one of the largest predicted trust deed firms in Scotland has recently written to a number of creditors and existing trust deed cases and asked if they would agree to an increase in the fixed fee, which can only be done through creditor agreement. And the AIB's position on that is creditors would have to vote, and if a majority of them voted, then it could happen in each individual case. So I'm not sure why it would differ with DAS cases if that was to be the case.
Okay, thanks very much.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. ICAS in particular raised concerns that the fee increases proposed moves DAS away from a debt management tool to more of an insolvency option. Why do you say that, and what are the practical implications of this?
I mean, I think, when you go back to the basic tenor of what is insolvency, it's something where somebody is unable to pay their debts as they fall due. So no matter what you put round about it, all of these, whether it's a debt payment plan or protected trust deed sequestration, they are all insolvency solutions one way or another. They are all around dealing with a debtor who is unable to pay their debts as they fall due. The difference is whether there is guaranteed debt relief out of it and how much the creditor gets back. And I think when you look at the tenors of each of the solutions, I come back to that point again, that now we're ending up in a position where all of the debt solutions are very, very similar. It's the same outcome for the debtor in terms of the amount of payment. The creditor is taking a hit on their recovery. They're just taking a bigger hit now on the recovery if these regulations go through. So on all those bases, these are insolvency solutions. Whether we call them an insolvency solution or not, that is what they are.
What do you think of the practical implications of this set of regulations then, in light of what you've just said?
I mean, we've heard previously around debtors perhaps not understanding the consequences of the various debt solutions, and the suggestion that perhaps DAS is better than some of the other solutions. I think the reality from that is far from the truth. The reality is around, the credit reference agencies make no distinction whatsoever between DAS and a sequestration. So the marker that goes on the credit reference file for future mortgage consultation or such like is exactly the same one, whether it's in DAS or protected trust deed or sequestration. The regulations, I guess, they're reducing some of the administrative burden. So, there are positive stuff around that. But in terms of whether this is likely to fundamentally swing somebody to decide to go into DAS than something else, I don't believe that's the case at all. The ultimate question really is, what is the most appropriate debt solution? And that is not going to be determined fundamentally by the tweaks that we have here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. The regulations contain some administrative changes around short payment breaks and applications for variations, etc. These appear to be relatively uncontroversial. Would the panel agree? Okay, that's fine. And revisiting a question I asked the last time, I mean, we are faced with a a number of options to deal with an instrument like this. We can recommend Parliament rejects it. We can go back to the Minister and suggest potential changes and have a negotiation, etc. What would your view be as to, if you were in our position, as to what we should do with this regulation, given that this is legislation we cannot formally amend? It's a question of a potential ping-pong or a recommendation to approve or reject.
David referenced earlier that it may not affect fundamental change to the overall process. I guess our position is that incremental, marginal change is better than no change. So in the absence of fundamental change, if we have a set of regulations that results in creditors receiving more of a return and results in debtors contributing more to the debt, and if the regulations is likely to increase the participation or use of DAS, then we support that, the laying of the regulations.
Yeah, we would. I mean, we're happy with the regulations as they are. If the committee has any means of communicating that they need a similar, we need some similar changes in relation to protected trust deeds, that would be extremely beneficial for us, I think.
Of course, that's not within our gift. It's
No,
up to
of
government to introduce secondary
record.
legislation on that. I mean, those are points I'm sure that we will reflect upon and potentially, perhaps, you know, relay to the Minister. I can't make any commitments on behalf of the committee, but obviously that evidence has come through fairly strongly, so I think you can be reassured we'll be saying something about that anyway to the Minister, even though this regulation doesn't affect them.
I think I've stated before, we support the regulations. I think, you know, the real fundamental question obviously is around the Regulation 4, and you know, I think for the committee, you know, there is a framework that is in these regulations. It's not complete, and I guess the question is, what assurances are there or can be obtained from ministers and the accountant in bankruptcy around filling in those gaps. The key issues, I guess, around that being around transparency and accountability going forward.
Transparency and accountability in relationship to specifically what?
The setting of the fees or whatever framework or, you know, the detail, I guess, in behind that. But, you know, the framework there is there, I guess, for a 20% fee. How that's then split, how that's then managed, how the surplus is returned, etc., is detail that just simply isn't in the regulations at the moment. Obviously, there has been that the consultation, but we don't know the outcome of that as yet. So, you know, I think it's around, is there sufficient assurance to satisfy people around the detail of those schemes and how the framework would be applied in practice. To me, is the fundamental question.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that particular? And this is an issue you raised earlier in the session. Is it your view that ideally the regulations should be quite specific and clear about that, and therefore quite fixed in its approach, or the benefits of the proposed arrangements at the moment are they leave room for quite a bit of flexibility, which is sometimes useful?
Flexibility certainly is sometimes useful. As I say, I think my concerns would be dependent upon how that scheme looks. So, you know, as I said earlier on, and it's really around how the surplus is calculated for the AIB to then redistribute back to the free debt advice sector. Is it going to go back to individual organisations, or is it going back to a central government fund?
So in essence,
so, you know, to me, I think, you know, the more direct it is back to individual organisations, I think that needs to be tighter. You know, as I say, if it's a surplus that's going back to government funds for debt advice generally, I don't think there's much needs done around that. You know, as long as the method of calculation of the surplus is clear and there is accountability to that, whether that be in terms of the AIB's audit arrangements or Audit Scotland looking at that surplus calculation or whatever. But I think as long as there's some form of oversight around that, then I'm relatively comfortable with it.
Okay.
Are there any other questions from committee members?
Can I touch on the notion of flexibility, because
Perhaps if you want to do that briefly,
I think
yes.
that's important. I think our overall position is that the regulations seem fair and reasonable, and I think flexibility is featured in section 6 around method of payments. I think that gives flexibility around how it can be changed, how payments can be made going forward. Again, flexibility is also demonstrated in section 7 around the variation of creditor statements, and again also in section 8 the proposal for variation. So I think flexibility is actually something that is a common sense approach, and I think it was something that Alan had mentioned earlier. Also section 9 for the cohabitees, the change in payment breaks seems fair and reasonable, and this notion of fair and reasonable I think leads to more equitable outcomes for both the creditor and the debtor, and that's what we were looking for from the regulations to achieve. You won't always achieve a perfect scenario for everybody, but if we're coming at it from a fair and reasonable perspective, then I think the regulation creates a framework, to use David's words from earlier, creates a framework that's flexible and fair and reasonable. I don't necessarily see that the changes that have been laid over the time are necessarily a problem. I think it's healthy to identify when something's not working best and then attempt to make changes and make fixes to it. So I think that I would be concerned if this regulation doesn't pass, then there are more risks than there are rewards. So let's make the regulation changes happen and continue to tweak and fix and improve where problems are identified, rather than not pass them.
Perhaps I could ask a final question. I mean, we've heard a bit about Glasgow or perhaps Edinburgh, the larger cities. What about the other areas in Scotland, sort of the Highlands and Islands, for example, the regions or smaller towns or cities like Stirling, for example? Will these regulations have the same effect for people in those areas in terms of accessibility? Will they help them?
You go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Our experience of write-offs tends to occur more in urban environments than rural environments, and we conclude that that is the access to affordable credit tends to be lesser in urban environments, and therefore the propensity for repayment of credit tends to be higher. Thus, the write-off rates are lower. So we find that in our more remote credit unions, there tends to be a lower rate of loan write-offs than there would be, for example, in a Glasgow environment.
I'm not sure. I don't think we've done enough analysis to agree or disagree, although I would say that some of our members in the Highlands have certainly been very active in raising their concerns about protected trust deeds. So I'd say it's a concern right across the country. In terms of how this addresses it, I don't know if I'm in a position to comment on whether this will improve DAS access in those areas. I think that's probably more for the money advice sector to comment on.
Again, I think that it comes back to the question around capacity. Do the regulations create additional capacity? The local authority, free debt advice sectors, charities, and such like, they're at capacity at the moment. The commercial sector, I guess, in terms of the debt advice that they're given, it's pretty geographically agnostic. So, a lot of debt advice now is being given over the phone or web chat or whatever. So I don't think these regulations will particularly have an effect on urban or rural areas in any difference. I think it'll be the same across the board.
But it doesn't sound like something that's been looked at specifically. Is that fair to say?
I'm certainly not aware of it being looked at in those contexts, but that's probably more for the IB policy unit, I would guess.
Going forward, perhaps.
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for coming in today. At this point in time, I'll suspend this session, and we'll suspend the public session, and we'll move then into private session.